What's going on, guys? Aarava here, and welcome back to Let's Talk F1 2017. This one for the brand new Haas, the VF17. Haas's second Formula 1 car now, obviously their second year since entering the sport, and it's the first one they've had a real crack at where they've already been entrants into the season. Obviously, last year's Haas car, it was very, very different. They had a bit of freedom before they entered the championship to do further testing than other teams would have had because they weren't official contestants, but now it's their kind of second and first proper entry as already contestants from last season. But saying that, they've really upped the complexity of the car in a way which is really impressive to see, because of, especially with the change regulations anyway from 2016 to 2017. That's a big enough change in itself, on top of the fact of just trying to improve the car year on year for a brand new team like that. And you can clearly see straight away they've taken a few nods here and there from their kind of bigger counterpart, if you like, Ferrari. Obviously the nose, it's a thumb nose. It's pretty much like a trend for most teams, but the way they've specifically styled it, it's taken some nods and inspirations from Ferrari, but of course they're not really allowed to copy anything exact for exact, but it's more of like an inspiration. We've seen inspirations a lot of the time from other teams to, compared to other teams, teams, once they find a solution that they think will be better, they'll probably more or less or not kind of try and mimic it a little way in their own style. So Haas has gone for that sort of nose, but the front wing sculpted on the edges to again try and get airflow around the tyre, to try and neaten up flow coming off the sidewall of the tyre and the wake of the tyre. And then the inside part of the front wing obviously kind of just modified, a lot like what they ended up with in 2016 at Abu Dhabi, but modified and stretched out to meet the 2017 regulations and what they need, obviously, with that larger kind of width of the entire car itself. But they've left off a few components they ended with at Abu Dhabi, so maybe a little bit of a simplification. I think you'll be seeing some changes maybe throughout pre-season testing. That goes for every team pretty much. But if we move on further up the car, you can see I've noted the winglet coming off the main chassis, so dagger-like winglets, just like we've seen with the Mercedes and Ferrari car coming off the main chassis. This one doesn't connect to a bargeboard, unlike the McLaren car, just kind of, standstill winglets, but very chunky winglets, actually. You'll see from the overhead view, actually quite large winglets just ahead of the intake. So that will be one splitting the air in two different regions, either towards the inlet itself of the side pod or towards the top, where you can see I've noted the two vortex generators underneath the upright stretching across, or also the air going underneath obviously is going to get channeled towards that side pod underneath undercut area, and that's going to eventually feed off around the side pod towards the diffuser. And also, interestingly enough, unlike most teams, Haas have gone for a bit of a split floor at the front of the floor. Usually you see a few splits and slot gaps and squirt slots at the very rear of the floor, just ahead of the rear tyre. But you can see from this angle, and from other angles you can't really see it properly, but from this angle you can see a split floor on the left. I've circled it just above the front left tyre. That split floor, you've got two little arching metal pieces to connect it there, so that makes it, not a complete actual hole in the floor, more of a slot gap. So interesting little details there, along with the floor curling in on itself and kind of arching, as you can see, we'll see later on from the side profile of the floor. So Haas using some nice details on the floor to try and manipulate that flow. That'll be to kind of squirt it either towards the main section at the very rear of the car, towards the diffuser, or even more intricately towards this region between the rear tire and the rear wing to help smoothen out the kind of sidewall turbulent air coming off the rotating, now even chunkier rear tyres this year in 2017. If we move on to that overhead shot I was talking about, you can see that chunky profiled winglet coming off the chassis there. So very nice view for a lot of these cars that have these winglets now. Look quite nice on the bird's eye view. But you can see the barge board a lot more clearly now from this view. They've got almost like a double element at the front and also a double element to end it off and taper it off at the furthest side on the left-hand side there on the barge board. And then underneath, you can see of the barge board, they've also got this extending black winglet that goes underneath the main silver winglet in yellow. So they've got this kind of secondary element there that goes underneath, which you can't see the detail of from outside. And that again will be helping flow stay attached on that actual surface and go towards the beginning of the side pod inlets and then towards the round the rest of the car. If you look towards the rear end, you can see what I meant by the squirt slots, and those are innate to try and get air to that region I've noted out in squiggly green lines, that region between the rear tyre and the rear wing. Turbulent air is coming off the tyre. they want to try and create almost like a vacuum seal, if you will, sort of region of air there, because that will allow the diffuser to work a lot more efficiently, because there's less air coming in from the side that's turbulent and disrupting the flow as a whole, and that will make that entire section work more efficiently than with the rear wing. Moving on to a diagonal shot of the Haas car, they've got blown wheel nuts on the front axle, so good to see from a team like Haas. Obviously, they're only their second attempt in F1, and they're already going straight in with the blown wheel nuts, so that's impressive to see, really. But we move on to the detailing of the barge boards, again in yellow. You can see that kind of double element on the very far side of the barge board, and then obviously the other side of the barge board is blocked off by the front tyre, and then you can see that winglet yet again, and then a really nice, actually tight packaged rear end for the Haas. They've tried to tighten up a little bit more than they did last year, and generally that entire section looks a lot more neater than it was last year. If we move back to the front of the car though, you can see the profile of the nose, but just under the Richard Mille sponsor, you can see I've noted 2 black winglets, which you'll be able to see a lot better actually in an on-track picture of the Haas car. But the winglets very early on in the nose, and actually quite complex as well, splitting into 2 different elements for the second one on the left there. And then you can see the fin from this angle of the Haas car, which a lot of people are saying on Twitter, probably the nicest looking fin so far, as they've tried to use a bit of geometric shapes there to just make the fin look more interesting, the way they've profiled it as well. Probably one of the nicest looking fins on most of the cars this year. And then again, you can see the detailing of the slot gaps and some uprights on the rear floor. Moving on to the side picture on track that I just mentioned. Here now you can see under the Richard Mille sponsor, you can see clearly now these 2 early winglets, and the second one of the 2 further back towards the suspension arm split into a double element. The first one, they've got a curling kind of vein coming off the very edge of it. So that's going to be interacting with the air going on either side of the nose cone, you know, in between, and also on the inside face of the actual front wing elements very, very early on. So they're getting very, very early interaction with the flow, whereas usually teams like to let the flow go on a little bit further, interact with the suspension arms, and then you start to get a channeling of winglets. But Haas have chosen a very early stage to start interacting with the flow, so potentially they know exactly where they want to try and get that flow to go. You know, you've got that grey winglet just coming off the chassis, you've got the barge boards in a certain way, so maybe they've tried to specifically target areas where they want to feed the air with these 2 earlier black winglets. And then I've just noted out the kind of flow again of the blown wheel nut. The air will come out straight through the blown wheel nut and try and smoothen that flow on that entire edge, side edge of the car. And then once again here you can get a nice look in of that tight rear end on the Haas, that they try to pinch it as much as they can to that rear side. And finally, as we move on to some other shots from the rear end of the car, you can see a bit more of the detailing of the barge board from the other side, and you can see the nice undercut profile shape of the Haas sidepod. And a lot of what teams do now these days is really quite chunky undercut of the front face of the sidepod as they try and taper it then quite neatly towards the rear end. But you don't often get to see this angle of the car that way, obviously. But as we move on to the rear end, you've got the usual streaks on the very bottom of the end plate of the rear wing to take air downwards and try and close off the diffuser a little bit more, make it work more efficiently with the rear wing. At the top, you can see the difference from Haas to other teams with the complexity of those slot gaps at the very front. Haas has still got that cordon off slot gap, whereas most teams now these days are running the Toro Rosso style open-ended slot gaps at the very front. So just that difference you can see in development and R&D. But I would imagine Haas maybe will go for that open-ended one eventually this season as they, you know, focus on R&D, and maybe even, you never know, during testing and they're rapidly focusing on R&D, you may see that even come into play there. But they've also got a slot gap on the very front leading edge of the end plate as well to bleed air downward towards, again, that section I mentioned before in the video in squiggly green lines between the rear tyre and the rear wing, all in aid to make that area work more efficiently, create that vacuum seal. And that's the same job with the shark fin, trying to make that entire rear end work more efficiently by straightening up the flow. And then from the side view, if we brighten up the side view again, you can see again that same complexity of the barge boards, that fin winglet coming off the chassis. And then you can also see the upright now. You can see more clearly from this angle. It's got a bit of a curve again, so not exactly the full-on extreme dogleg we've seen from Renault and McLaren on that upright, but you can see the general consensus of most of these teams is actually to curve it right, and then it curves back out left into that almost dog shape leg shape, but the Haas obviously doesn't go the full way. Haas not running an S-duct again for this season, but you know, you never know if they get to a point where they feel like that's then the next best step, they might run it indeed. But obviously throughout testing you'll see different configurations for all cars. And speaking of that, the Red Bull car did launch earlier, but it was very clear and apparent Red Bull are definitely hiding some things, because their car seemed very elegant but simplified in many areas, including the Bargeboard area. So I do know the Red Bull car has launched. You don't need to tell me about it in the comments below, but I'm not going to be doing a video on the Red Bull yet until they release studio shots, proper lit studio shots, and or once they've done a bit of testing and maybe reveal the true complexity of that car, because I really do think Red Bull are hiding something with their car, so I don't think it's worth quite yet me doing a whole video on the analysis of the Red Bull. But by all means, in the comments below, let me know what you also think about the Red Bull look. But that's been the video for the Haas car, so more importantly, tell me what you think about the Haas car. A lot of people saying the fin, definitely the most prettiest one we've seen on the grid so far. But if you did enjoy the video, found it useful, then give it a like button. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. If you're new around here, then do subscribe for weekly Formula 1 content. That's been the Haas 2017 Challenger. Surprisingly, quite nice. A lot of nice details from Haas. Good to see from them. A few nods here and there to Ferrari, but all in all, a great step for them, I think, going on to the 2017 season. And here's hoping, I think, personally for me, and I think for most people, that they'll make a step forward and maybe continue some good performances. Obviously, we saw them exponentially high performances at the beginning of 2016, and then they tailed off towards the end of the season. Here's hoping they can get a bit more of a consistent performance across the board over the entire season, but we'll just have to wait and see, obviously. But that's been this video. Hope you enjoyed the day, and I'll see you guys next time.